Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the Obs Pod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the Obs Pod is for you. Episode 188, a chat with Frances, consultant midwife. On today's episode, I am welcoming Frances Rivers, consultant midwife, who I work with at my own trust and who I do a joint clinic with. And I'm embarrassed to say that despite having a fantastic working relationship, it had not popped into my head to have her on the podcast, which is really terrible, until somebody said to me, "Why haven't you done a joint one with Frances?" So it seemed like a splendid idea. So here we are. Frances.
Here we are. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Do you want to introduce yourself? Say a little bit about yourself.
Yes. So, as you said, I'm a consultant midwife at Kingston in Southwest London, and I've been working there on and off for almost 10 years now, and actually trained there as a midwife. And then I went off and worked at other trusts and then came back. I actually started out on a different career pathway. So I started out in life as a TV journalist and did that for about 10 years. So very different from midwifery. And that was in my 20s. And then had children, and that sort of steered me away from the world of travel and TV news and down a different pathway. And I ended up in the midwifery and birthing world and have been there ever since. So yeah, now my day-to-day role is as a consultant midwife. I'm the only one at our trust where we have about almost 5,000 births a year. And so it's a big job for one person.
I guess a consultant midwife, I think of as a relatively new role. So certainly when I started in my career in the 90s, there wasn't such a thing, or if there was, I didn't know about it. So what is the role of a consultant midwife, if for people that aren't familiar with that?
You're right that they are relatively new. So I think the first consultant midwives came into being around sort of 2000, turn of the century, with the idea that often what could happen is that as midwives progress through their career and become more experienced, that they'd end up in managerial roles, sort of behind the scenes, running a unit, but actually no longer involved in caring for women in any way and using their clinical skills. Which is quite different from senior doctors like yourself. You know, as a consultant obstetrician, obviously most of your time is still spent on the shop floor clinically. The consultant midwife is slightly different, I would say. And I think, you know, when I speak to my colleagues who are fellow consultant midwives, we all approach the role slightly differently. And I quite like the fact that there isn't a kind of set, if you like, you know, you must do it this way or that way, and that you've got quite a lot of freedom in how you interpret the role. But there are supposedly these four pillars of the role. So that's sort of clinical expertise. And that might be that you have a specific expertise which might have come about through a specialist role that you've done. So, for instance, there are consultant midwives who have come up through the public health route or through providing specialist mental health services to women. And then there are others that will have more traditional kind of expertise in providing intrapartum care. So I guess my own clinical expertise is around supporting physiological birth. That's my real passion, particularly home birth, and midwife-led care. But also a lot of what I do is around supporting women's choices. And that involves meeting women regularly, to support choices, particularly when they don't align with what we're recommending. And when I say we, I mean we, the maternity unit, doctors, midwives. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. So that's one pillar. Then you've got the professional leadership. So that's about being a bit of a figurehead, a sort of champion for midwives, whether that's within your own trust or externally, appearing on things like this podcast or going to conferences, and being a voice for midwives. And within the trust where you work, certainly how I see it, it's about being a voice in the room where decisions are made, whether that's about guidelines or the direction that we're going in, changes to clinical pathways, and being that voice for midwives and for women as well, and always thinking about what the woman's experience of whatever it is that we're proposing is going to be, what impact it will make on her. And I'm that voice, I always think. And then there's the third pillar is about research. So I am absolutely passionate about evidence, and our use of evidence in practice. So research is obviously how we develop that evidence, and I've been involved in research projects myself, doing my own research, and then in much bigger pieces of research that others are leading on. And then the fourth pillar is education. So that's about training, and being involved in the training of midwives. So I regularly teach, for instance, I was teaching yesterday our midwives about how we can support what I call personalised care. Again, that's around supporting women's choices and making sure that those women are heard and have a voice and have those choices supported. So it's a lot.
I was just
And
thinking that, listening to you, it's like, oh my gosh, how do you cram that all in?
well, and I think, to be honest, you can't. So you have to pick and choose. And this is what I've learned over the years doing the job. And you can't be everything to everybody. And sometimes I do feel like this, that you're just constantly running from one thing to the next without ever pausing. And you have to just decide what your priorities are, and they will be different at different times.
Mm.
Um, and sometimes it is really important to just be there for that. For instance, recently I've attended quite a few home births, which have been quite complex, and it's been important for me to be there. And then at other times, I'll take more of a step back, and actually, I'm focusing on making improvements to a particular pathway. For instance, really trying to improve women's experience of induction of labour at the moment
Mm.
at our trust. So, yeah, it's just about just picking what your focus is,
Yes,
and trying to do that as well as you can. And of course, you're always working with a team. You're not on your own.
yes. I hadn't thought about it in that respect of being able to be a more senior midwife, but also being clinical, because I always found that really baffling when I was doing medical management, that I would still be going to the labour ward and doing my sessions and then stepping away and doing the management of the service, whereas my contemporary, head of midwifery was just doing the management of the service. So I hadn't thought about the consultant midwife in that way. Is that why you decided you'd like to be a consultant midwife, to retain that clinical practice?
I think so. For me, if I don't see women regularly, then it sort of I would lose the passion for it, I think.
Mm.
And I get the most out of it by just meeting women every day and hearing what they have to say and hearing what their experiences are and also what they're hoping for, and trying to make that happen for them. So, having worked briefly as a matron myself, I would just like to give a big shout out to all matrons across the country, because it is a really unforgiving, challenging role, but so important. making sure that there are enough midwives, enough support workers, enough nurses on the shift to keep everybody safe. And a lot of it is behind the scenes. And, it's absolutely essential for the safe running of a maternity unit, but it's not what kind of drives me to get out of bed in the morning. So it wasn't a job that I wanted to continue doing for very long, but I'm really
Yes,
glad that I did it for a brief time because I learned a lot doing it. And
yes,
it's just important to understand, that operational side of things. But for me, I
yes,
still want to have that connection with the women, and to be able to, go to a home birth and watch a baby be born into a pool and all of that. I would hate to miss out on that.
yes, yes. So you mentioned that you spend a lot of time seeing women. So do all UK maternity units have a consultant midwife? And if they do, how do women access or get to see a consultant midwife?
Not all maternity units have a consultant midwife. There isn't a sort of legal obligation, if you like, to have one. And I have to confess, I don't know the current number of consultant midwives across the country. But if a woman wants to contact a consultant midwife, she just speaks to her community midwife, her clinic midwife about how she might do that. I think one of the roles that we have as consultant midwives is to make ourselves as accessible as possible. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that women should be referring themselves directly to us, but I do think it's really important that women know that we exist and what we're there for, and that we're there for everybody. Because I think one of the issues that we have at the moment is that we have women who know that they have a voice and that they can make choices. And that's great. But there are also many women who don't know that they have a voice and that they can, decline aspects of care or make choices about where they give birth or how they give birth or when they give birth. And, you don't know what you don't know. So if people don't tell you that, then they're never going to end up seeing me in my clinic. So it is really important, I think, that we make sure that midwives know that our doors are open to everybody. And there's ongoing work, I think, to do around that. And a lot of the research that I did, which looked at place of birth and ethnicity, did show that there were significant disparities between, white women and, for instance, Asian or Black women, and where they chose to give birth or where they ended up giving birth. And I think a lot of that potentially has to do with whether women are aware of their options. So definitely work to do there. And that's something that I and my colleagues in the consultant midwife sort of world need to address.
Yeah, I think so. Reading your research and realizing that disparity really, I don't know, it really brought it home to me. There's lots of talk in maternity about inequality or inequity, and but to kind of see the lack of knowledge, awareness, even thinking about home birth or water birth or birth centre birth for certain sections of our population is really stark. And I think the way we run the referrals into your clinic and our joint clinic is really good. So we have a referral form that any midwife can fill up and refer people to come and see Frances, which Frances will go through and decide which ones she sees and which ones might be better seen jointly. But it was very gratifying to me when you looked at the numbers of people coming to our clinic that it did actually match our background population, that we have got the same sorts of percentages of Black and brown women coming to our joint clinic as we have in our population overall.
You're right. I mean, I think the midwives that we work with in our trust know that that service exists, but I don't think we should pretend that there isn't still disparity there.
Mm.
And, it's about trying to understand the causes behind that, and they're multifactorial. Certainly, when I did my research, so I looked at the last 10 years of data at our trust, and looked at, sort of accounted for things like, was it that women from other ethnic groups had comorbidities, for instance, that might prevent them from accessing different places of birth? Or was it something else? And I interviewed a very small number of South Asian women to ask them about how they'd made their decisions about place of birth. And it was so interesting hearing them talk about their decision making. And a lot of it is down to just a sort of cultural assumption that I don't think is unique to South Asian women. I think it's actually quite prevalent in most societies that hospital is the safest place to give birth, and not just hospital, but on a labour ward with doctors. And I think that is a view that many, probably the majority of women hold. So when that is the kind of prevalent view, then it takes quite a lot, I think, to change that mindset. And it's really interesting to talk to people who have come to a different decision about, well, what was it that changed your mind? Often it wasn't actually a midwife that changed their mind. It was more likely to be a friend, a sister
Mm.
who would say, oh, I gave birth in a birth centre. It was amazing. You should give it a go.
Yeah.
Or they'd, been on social media and seen some, I don't know, Instagram account where a woman had said, oh, my water birth was fabulous.
Mm.
And this woman had thought, oh, I've never thought about that. So there are
Yeah.
so many influences, aren't there? And we're just a small part of that. But I
Yes.
do think we have a duty, and we as midwives and obstetricians too, to not be afraid to give women evidence about the benefits, because I think sometimes, particularly midwives, are a bit reluctant to say, well, you might benefit more from this going to this place than going to that place.
Mm.
And I'm talking about really widespread evidence that's been around for a long time now, that says healthy women with uncomplicated pregnancies are much more likely to have a straightforward vaginal birth if they go into spontaneous labour and choose to go to a birth centre than if they choose to go to a labour ward. I'm not saying that that is right for all women, but even to just be given that information is really powerful. So again, it's going back to my role as a consultant midwife, I think, is to try and empower the midwives to not be afraid of sharing that evidence, to know the evidence in the first place, and then to actually make sure that women are aware of it, because then they can make an informed decision.
Yeah, I do find it a bit weird because we talk a lot about evidence-based medicine or evidence-based practice, but it's like we pick and choose the evidence.
Yeah.
So, and it's kind of, but we should be shouting out some of the birthplace evidence. You're much less likely to have a cesarean, you're much less likely to tear, you're much less likely to need assistance if you start in a birth centre or a home. But we're not giving people that evidence, or if we are, I don't know, it's not kind of sinking into the collective consciousness.
Well, and also, so that evidence is there. So there's overwhelming evidence for that particular population, and actually for some women, even with some additional risk factors. There's good evidence emerging around older women, or women with high BMIs, or women who have gestational diabetes that's well controlled. That those women also have really good outcomes if they give birth in a midwife-led setting. But despite all that evidence, like you say, for some reason, birth centres, midwife-led units, the birth rate in those is declining. And again, so I think my role is to really question that, to shout about that, and to say, what are we doing about it? So here I am saying, what are we doing about it?
Yes.
Because, you know, 10 years ago, births in birth centres were, in double digits, sort of 12, 14%, and they've more than halved now. So, like you said, if we were following the evidence, they should be on the increase, not on the decrease. So, what's
Yes.
gone wrong there?
Yes. I think that's something. So you and I went to a conference together and they presented that evidence about the reduction in midwifery-led unit births. I was really shocked, actually. And I think it's important to say for people listening that that doesn't result in an improvement in outcomes. It's not that, oh, by moving births from a midwifery-led unit to a hospital, they're safer for the baby or the mother. In fact, you could say they could be less safe because of more intervention potentially. So it is a really, I think, a big worry, that decline. I agree.
But I do think that when you have the right leadership in place, and I'm not talking about me personally necessarily, but I do think at our trust, we have a culture there which does support midwife-led care. So
Mm.
you can buck the trend, and we do buck the trend at our unit. We do have a birth rate in our midwife-led unit of around 14% a month, and a home birth rate of sort of 2 to 3% a month, so that both those are well above the national average. And why is that? Because we've got a senior leadership team of midwives and obstetricians who value it and who see that it is important. And we've also got women who want it and who make their voices heard. So for those units that are struggling, I do think it is about looking at, is there support from your leadership for it? And I do think that's what partly the role of the consultant midwife is for. Like I said before, to be the voice in the room that says, hang on a minute, this is really important. This is what the evidence says. This is what women want. There's that phrase, isn't there? If you build it, they will come. If
Yes.
you close midwife-led units, then of course your rate is going to plummet. If it's always
Yeah.
closed, then
Yes.
women can't give birth there. But if you keep them open and you staff them and you make them a priority and you clearly show that they are a priority to your staff and to your women, then they will come.
They will come. Yeah. And I think the obstetric voice is really important alongside that. As I think quite a lot about what's the obstetric role when midwifery care is so beneficial. How do you support it, but in the background, so that when things deviate from physiology, then you're there and you can make sensible decisions when intervention is required, but you're supporting that midwifery care, but a step back, if you sort of mean.
Absolutely. There's got to be that mutual respect, hasn't there? And I think there absolutely is, where we work. I really value my obstetric colleagues, and you can't exist without each other. So I think there's so much in the media at the moment, isn't there? And there has been in
Mm.
these successive inquiries about a sort of them and us between midwives and obstetricians. And I just don't see it personally where I work. So I don't know what you think, Florence, but I do value the idea of a kind of healthy tension, I think is what I would call it, because we do come from different perspectives and our training is different. But I think that's a benefit, not a risk, because you don't want everyone in an organization all having exactly the same viewpoints and all just going yes, yes, yes all the time. It's
Yeah.
really important to have sort of healthy debate and healthy challenge and respectful challenge.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you that you need that diversity of opinion and different perspectives, and that's how you evolve, isn't it? So, you can discuss things and you might shift your opinion because of something I've said, and vice versa. I might slightly think, oh, I hadn't thought about this in the way Francis is describing. So I think you're absolutely right. You're richer, definitely, for those different opinions, and you'll hopefully come out in a better place.
Definitely. I mean, and I've had consultant obstetricians come to me and actually challenge me, almost in reverse, saying, why are you worried about this woman coming to the birth center? Actually, I think it would be a really good place for her to
Mm,
be. Or, and I will do the same thing. I will say to a consultant obstetrician, why do you think this woman, I don't know, for instance, needs continuous
mm,
electronic fetal monitoring in labor? What is it that you're really concerned about, or how concerned are you? Because, so often it isn't black and white, is it?
yes.
And so much of what we're dealing with, and particularly what I see, I normally I'm seeing women where there are several complexities, or there isn't good evidence for their particular risk factors. And so there isn't a sort of definite right or wrong answer as to, well, we definitely think you should give birth by this point, or we definitely think you shouldn't have a vaginal birth, or you definitely shouldn't give birth in a birth center, or whatever it is.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And so moving on to personalised care, which you mentioned earlier, you're kind of doing some training and teaching for wider midwifery staff. We do a lot of personalised care together. Do you think that's on the increase?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, when I first started as a midwife, I don't think I'd even heard, I mean, I call it personalized care, which is a bit of a mouthful, but a lot of people talk about out of guidance. And I don't think I'd ever heard of that phrase until I was quite a long way into my career. And I'm sure there were always women who were making decisions that didn't align with recommendations, but I think it's just become more and more prominent and more women are aware, perhaps, of their rights, of their human rights in terms of what they can say yes or no to. And I do think that's really important. And perhaps the whole nature of, I guess traditionally the medical profession was seen as this profession where what you said was what went,
Yeah.
this paternalistic sort of
Yes.
idea. And that has changed hugely, hasn't it? I'm sure you've seen that in your career, but probably over the last sort of 20, 30 years, really shifted. And I do think that's for the better, but it does also create lots of tensions and uncertainties, and it's sort of trying to navigate those. I do think we're in a climate now. So I really welcome the fact that many women feel able to voice what they want, but it can be challenging when sometimes women are making choices that it's really difficult for us to support safely, or we may think that. And, we could debate definitions of safety, but in things like women declining so many aspects of care, that we worry that they are putting themselves in a position where they may ultimately compromise the safety of their own health, or that of their babies. And that's their choice to make, but that can be really challenging to navigate. And I think in the climate that we're in now, where more and more women are talking about trauma in their birth experiences, that unfortunately is leading to more women sort of disengaging from care and wanting to either, I think what we see, both of us, isn't it? More and more women either going down a route of saying, I'm just too scared to have a vaginal birth and I want to have a planned cesarean that I can completely control, or I don't want your care at all and I'm going to go and sort of do it by myself or with very minimal midwifery or obstetric input.
Yeah, I think I find it really difficult. I mean, the personalised care, some of the conversations are great. Some of the conversations can be almost embarrassing because you're having to go, well, the national guidance recommends blah de blah. So, for example, continuous CTG might be a case in point. National guidance is that you are recommended to have continuous CTG, but actually the evidence is that it doesn't make any difference. So I've got to, as a health professional, tell you something that actually doesn't have a good base of evidence. So I find that quite complicated. And I mean, you know, we're very honest in
Mm.
our clinic, and we just say that to women. This is the national guidance, but um, but there are some things that I end up feeling really concerned that a woman hasn't heard or hasn't maybe understood the degree of concern I have about some of the choices she's making. And you're right, it's absolutely her body. She's autonomous. She makes that decision. But it can be a very uncomfortable place as a professional, can't it?
It can, and I think, it's finding that balance. So I
Yeah,
totally fundamentally believe in a woman's right to choose what happens to her body. And I think, we all do, but it's trying to balance that with, like you say, that discomfort. And and a woman might say, well, I don't care about your discomfort, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. But as a healthcare professional, and just as a human being as well, it can be really, you can feel very vulnerable because although you're not responsible for someone's decisions, and I always say that to midwives, you are not responsible for their decisions, you're just responsible for sharing what evidence there is. And like you said, sometimes the evidence is poor and we should be honest about that. But just, we do have that responsibility. We're not responsible for their decisions, but that doesn't mean that as human beings, we're not affected by those decisions. And particularly, if sometimes, unfortunately and devastatingly, the consequences of their decisions can mean that the worst possible outcome happens, and for the family that's absolutely catastrophic, but it also really hits the healthcare professional, and that's something that we have to live with, as
yeah,
healthcare
yeah.
professionals anyway, isn't it? It's something we deal with.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I know also, sort of as an extension of that, there is quite an increase of free birth. And I know you hear a bit about that on the consultant midwife network. And so I suppose what we're trying to do is try and meet women. So, like you say, they're not feeling they can't have those conversations with us, and try and keep them at least receiving some care. But it's challenging because I know you do some teaching for Birthrights, the charity, about human rights in childbirth. And I know they've just done a report on coercion. So it's quite a tricky one to navigate, isn't it? What's good information versus what's coercion?
Absolutely. And I think every time I speak to a woman, counsel a woman, I'm always thinking about the language that I use, how I'm phrasing things. Am I listening? Because, so many of these reports that have come out in the last decade, Ockenden, Morecambe Bay, all of those women have said time and time again, I didn't feel heard. And so that's always at the forefront of my mind. Am I listening? I think you were talking about, in terms of free birth, you know, we feel as healthcare professionals that we want to provide care. That's why we've gone into this profession, because we think that women need and deserve good care and that we can provide that. So when women are making choices that don't align with our recommendations, really what we want to try and do is to keep them engaged because we fundamentally believe that they will benefit from our care. And if you've got women that are starting to disengage, I think it's about trying to keep their trust. And I think one of the ways that you can do that, and I sometimes say to midwives, is start by saying yes, don't start by saying no. So, and that's something that Birthrights, the charity, talk about too. So if someone is saying, for instance, and I've had this very case, a woman who was expecting twins and wanted to have a home birth. Now, of course, that's not what we normally recommend. But if you start by saying no, then you've instantly sort of alienated them and you may end up losing their trust. Whereas if you say yes and then continue the conversation, you're much more likely to keep them on side. And it's just about continuing that relationship. There's so much evidence, isn't there, around continuity of care. And it's so obvious when you are practicing it because you meet a woman for the first time and you're kind of sussing each other out a bit, aren't you? And she's sort of listening to what you have to say and you're listening to her, but you're never going to solve it all in one conversation necessarily, especially if it's quite complex. So if you can keep her on side, if you like, and meet her again and build that trust, then over time you're much more likely, I think, to come to some kind of compromise. And again, it's not about trying to coerce people, but it is just about trying to provide the care that you feel is safest, that they feel is safest, and somehow meet in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And kind of back to what you said about listening and really hearing what women are saying. I think one of the things I love best about the joint clinic we do is, I mean, some of the women have amazing outcomes, fantastic. But actually, the thing that's really important to me is the women that come and say, I feel I've been heard, I've been respected, and, my feelings have been acknowledged. And it may be ultimately that they have a different pregnancy or birth from what they perhaps was on their maybe wish list, but they feel properly they've been thought about and listened to. I think there's value in the conversations, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Definitely, there's value in the conversations, just giving them that space and that time, like you say, so that they do feel that you've heard their story, you've understood, especially if they've had previous trauma,
Mm.
um, that we've taken the time to listen to that and then made some kind of plan with them. And I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't always work out the way that they have hoped, but generally, if they feel like they've been treated with respect all the way through, then that doesn't matter.
Yeah. What's your zesty bit, Francis, from that conversation?
So my zesty bit would be to remember that all women, no matter where they come from, what their background is, what their medical history is, that they have choices about how they give birth, where they give birth, when they give birth. And if they don't know that, then we as midwives and doctors have a duty to let them know that they have a voice, to amplify that voice, particularly for women, who perhaps don't speak English as a first language, are less well educated. It's about remembering that all women have a right to make choices and to be heard. And if they're struggling to get that voice heard, then please remember that the consultant midwife is here to help you. So seek us out.
Thank you, Francis, for giving up your time to make this episode possible and giving everyone a real insight into what a consultant midwife is and does. I very much hope you found this episode of the Obs Pod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the Obs Pod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the obspod on Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the Obspod free and accessible to as many people as possible. But it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.